Hello, I'm Paul Innes, Professor of Shakespeare Studies, and welcome to my channel Shakespeare for All. Today I'm going to be talking about Romeo and Juliet. This is one of 3 videos on the play that deal with character, plot and context. This episode is about the plot of the play. At the end of the videos you'll find some useful study tips together with a list of keywords. Now I've been using the MIT online version of the text together with the more modern act and scene organisation of the Arden 3rd edition. If you are studying for any assessments, an edition with supporting material like this one is the kind of thing you need. If you want to know more, please remember to subscribe. Now, what we're going to do is take each act in turn. We'll look at the length of individual scenes and how the play moves between them, what happens, how it happens, and the speed at which it happens. We'll then look at the implications of this structure of the plot for the development of the play as a whole. As a broad overview of the play, what stands out, just looking at the line numbers, is that in this instance there are 3 relatively long acts followed by 2 much shorter ones. What this suggests is a long, careful expedition, and the play then speeds up as you move towards the end. So, to begin with, you have the prologue in Act 1, and there are 3 things worth mentioning here, 3 things to keep in mind. One is that the chorus, the prologue, provides you with foreknowledge of what's going to happen. The play starts by telling you it's a tragedy. It's going to end badly. Regardless of what you see in front of you, that's what's going to happen. The second main element is the social context, which is the violence between the 2 main families in the Italian city of Verona. And the third element is the difference, not the sameness, but the difference between Romeo and Juliet. Their behaviour is differentiated because Romeo is a young man and Juliet is a young woman. They're both the only children of the households. They're both heirs. Whoever has anything to do with them is going to inherit everything. It's going to inherit the whole lot, especially via Juliet. The difference between their behaviours is gendered. Keep that in mind. So the play begins with a prologue, a chorus, a figure that speaks outside the action for 14 lines. Tells a sonnet, uses a sonnet form. This is a type of poetry that's associated with courtly love discourse in the period. Sets everything up. It gives you, as audience, foreknowledge and also references the stage. It does that thing Shakespeare does all the time, so does contemporaries. Basically, remember this is a play, okay? That's what he's saying, or she's saying. There's then a very long, complex scene, 236 lines this one. It has several sub-scenes. It starts with a public fight between the servants, the retainers of the 2 noble houses, the Montagues, which is Romeo's family, and the Capulets, which is Juliet's family. Poor old Benvolio, Romeo's nice cousin, tries to stop it, and then the older men even try to join in. The 2 heads of the household turn up, who knows what age they are, and start having a go at each other, or at least trying to. The prince arrives. Prince Aeschylus, the guy who's ostensibly in control of this city, although he's very obviously not in control at all, and shouts saying he's going to sentence to death anybody from either of these families that starts the fighting again. Disturb the peace again, I'm going to kill you. What's crucial about this, and this is why I want to draw your attention to it, the protagonists are not even present. We always think of this play as about Romeo and Juliet and their mutual love and their personal relationship. They're not even on the stage yet. Eventually, Romeo arrives, posturing about love. His mum and dad say to Benvolio, go and find out what's wrong with him because we haven't seen him for days. You know, this guy is never in the house. He can wander around doing what he wants, and Benvolio goes off. You then move on to a reasonably long scene, 102 lines. This one has 3 sub-scenes. Lord Capulet is discussing politics and marriage with Count Paris. He's about to marry his daughter to the guy. And there's a bit of slapstick as Lord Capulet passes the list of invitees for a feast he's going to hold at the mansion that evening, basically to a serving man. And then he wanders off. The serving man's standing on stage going, because he's illiterate, he can't read. It's very common in this period. Romeo and Benvolio are standing there, turn up, and the serving man says, oh, excuse me, gentlemen, can you tell me what the names are on this bit of paper? Because I can't read. That's how they find out that there's a feast at the Capulet mansion. We then shift the scene to what's going on inside the Capulet house while all this has been happening. Juliet is with her mother and her nurse. This is domestic setting. Juliet is domesticated, and I use that word deliberately. She's always seen in relation to the household, unlike her male counterpart, Romeo. Her mother even has to be reminded exactly how old Juliet is. She's saying to the nurse, "It's this kind of marriage idea, she's not quite 14 yet, is that right?" And the nurse says, "That's right, she's not quite 14. Okay, fine." And marriage to Paris is being mentioned along with the feast. You then shift again to the evening with the Montague youths on the way to the party. There's a lot of banter, a lot of competitiveness. These are young lads daring each other to turn up at the household of the grand enemy, okay? And the famous Queen Mab speech by Mercutio is part of this. He's Romeo's cousin. All of this contest of wits between the lads. They're all carrying torches, which is an obvious fertility symbol in the period. Happens a lot with young men in this period on the stage. You then see the feast. All this is just the first act, okay? Romeo and Juliet meet and fall in love and speak a mutual sonnet. That signifies to the audience that this time, at least for Romeo, it's genuine, it's mutual. A lot's happened. Moving on to Act 2, you have another choral interlude. The chorus comes and speaks an impersonal commentary to the audience. And then you have a moment of simultaneous staging. That means zones of the stage where different things happen simultaneously. Romeo is hiding from Mercutio and Benvolio, who are looking for him. In the aftermath of the feast, they give up and wander off. And then you get the balcony scene. The staging here is important. Don't worry if you can't remember that in most editions this is Act 2, Scene 2. If you're mentioning it in an exam or an essay, just call it the balcony scene. We'll know what you're talking about. Very complex scene. Ends with Romeo in soliloquy on his own after Juliet's gone back inside, telling the audience he's going off to talk to a spiritual advisor. So they've declared the mutual love for each other and he's going to go do something about it because he's a young man. That's what men do. They're the active ones, according to patriarchy anyway. So you then get another soliloquy that introduces a friar. Soliloquies are long single speeches spoken by a character on their own on stage, telling the audience what's going on. Usually an important character. In this case, the fact that the friar gets his own soliloquy signifies to the audience that this guy's going to be important. Romeo turns up, they start to discuss the developing situation, and the friar obviously sees this possible relationship, and marriage in fact, as a way of brokering peace between the two feuding families. We then have Act 2, Scene 4, 208 lines, a long one. As with some of the other ones in this play, this is quite common in this play, long scenes are divided into sub-segments, shorter scenes if you like. It's in public. There's quite a bit of banter between Mercutio and Benvolio. Remember that Romeo has been missing for quite a while now. This is the day after the feast at the Capulet house. Romeo's been off to see the friar and basically they've arranged a marriage. So Romeo finally arrives and you get more banter. Romeo's starting to win the contest of wits. He is becoming more of a man rather than just a young lad among others. He's becoming the leader, which is what he should be because he's the Montague heir. There's even more joking about the place as Juliet's nurse arrives with a servant. Romeo relates to his mates outside the household. Juliet can only effect things outside her domestic environment via her nurse. She needs a go-between because she's a woman, because she's a girl. Most of the characters leave the stage and she has a private conversation with Romeo. Shift back to Juliet, worrying in soliloquy. The nurse arrives and after a bit of to-do, she tells Juliet to go to Friar Lawrence and he'll marry her with Romeo. This is all happening very, very quickly. Next scene, Romeo's with the friar, Juliet arrives and they go off to marry. That happens off stage. You don't actually see the marriage ceremony. What that does is draw attention to the meanings this marriage is going to generate. Act 3, this one's really complicated. There are 4 exceptionally important scenes in terms of plot development as long as a short one. So look at the first 3 scenes, all relatively long. Act 3, Scene 1, nearly 200 lines. The Montague youths, led by Mercutio, meet in public the Capulet youths, led by Tybalt. Battle of wits. Tybalt is actually looking for Romeo. Romeo turns up, he thinks a fight's about to start and intervenes to try to stop it. In the confusion, Tybalt mistakenly fatally stabs Mercutio, Romeo loses his temper and kills Tybalt in return and has to flee the scene. The prince, remember that useless prince Aeschylus, arrives with the heads of the two families and pronounces sentence of exile on Romeo. He regrets every moment of it, but he has to be seen to be trying to uphold the law. You then move to Juliet again in soliloquy on her own in her household. The nurse enters with news of Tybalt's death and Romeo's banishment. She tells Juliet that Romeo is currently at the friar's cell, and she sends the nurse to Romeo carrying her ring, telling him to come and see her one last time. Now that signifies marriage, ownership, husbandry, right? This is not a neutral message. Shift to the third scene. Romeo's at the friar's cell, lamenting the state of affairs when the nurse arrives. Romeo is so distraught, he even looks as though he's about to stab himself. Obviously that's foreshadowing. It suggests that Romeo's mind tends towards self-violence if things go wrong. That's going to matter. The nurse gives him Juliet's ring and tells him to go to her. The friar says, "Go to the city of Mantua for your exile and I'll keep in touch via your servant." You then get a little short, strange scene. This one works really well in performance because while all this is happening, you now see Lord Capulet in Paris, utterly oblivious, discussing the fact that they're going to marry Paris to Juliet. That's great, isn't it? A lot of dramatic irony here. The audience knows things the characters obviously do not. And then you get Act 3, Scene 5. It's a very long scene with 7 subsections. I'm not kidding, 7, okay? It's now in the morning after Romeo has killed Tybalt. He must leave for exile. He's just spent the night with Juliet. It's very complicated. So first of all, they're spending their final moments together. They're then interrupted by the nurse, who arrives with news that Juliet's mother is coming, and Romeo has to leave. Lady Capulet turns up and tells Juliet that she's about to get married. Juliet does not react well to this. She's just spent the night with her boyfriend, her husband actually. Then Dad comes in, Lord Capulet, and he goes mental. He totally goes berserk because his daughter is not doing what he demands she should. She must, because he's her father and he tells her what to do. Remember patriarchy in this period. Poor old Juliet is left with the nurse, and the nurse actually says to her, well, Romeo's been banished. Just go ahead and marry Paris anyway. So she's not exactly all that supportive. Juliet is not happy about this. She tells the nurse, "Let my mother know I'm going to do penance at Friar Lawrence's cell." The only way that Juliet can get out of the household at all, actually, is via religion. The scene ends with a short 8-line soliloquy by Juliet that patterns Romeo's earlier behaviour by mentioning death. And all of this is critical plot development. Act 4, which follows, is the shortest act in the play. It's all about Juliet while Romeo is in exile. You might not notice this when you read through the play. Romeo doesn't appear at all in the 4th act of the play. Why? He's the man who's active in the world. He's in exile in Mantua. Juliet is stuck in the house with a family that doesn't know she's just married the greatest enemy. She has to deal with a social web of obligations that Romeo doesn't. It starts off with Paris talking to the friar about his impending wedding to Juliet. Dramatic irony again. It gets really awkward when Juliet turns up. He says, "Hello, wife," and she said, "I'm not your wife yet." So it's quite awkward stuff. Paris leaves and she mirrors Romeo's earlier action with the knife. Right? She brings, waves her knife about in front of the friar's face, basically threatening to kill herself. That matters because that's in fact what she does later. Foreshadowing. The friar tells her about his plan to deceive everyone by giving her a drug. "Don't worry, I'll contact Romeo in Mantua and tell him you're not actually dead." There's then a really important little scene. It's only 47 lines, short scene, which is chock full of dramatic irony, where Juliet returns home and apparently submits to the will of her parents. She goes on her knees and begs forgiveness and overacts quite spectacularly. She then, as soon as they're gone, takes a drug. and has another important soliloquy as she falls asleep on the bed. Everyone's going to think she's dead. You then move to an incredibly short scene, it's only 27 lines, where the Capulet household is getting ready for what they think is going to be a marriage. And you have a slightly longer scene to finish off Act 4. All of this is taking place in the household, okay? With two subsections. Everybody finds Juliet's body, and the wedding joy turns to mourning, and there's a little emblematic sub-scene at the end when the servants of the household are talking about this, and they don't care. Right? This actually matters. This patterns what happened earlier with the illiteracy of the servant telling Benvolio and Romeo, basically, could you read this paper? That's where the feast is going to be. The low life, that's the wrong term to use, the lower orders, the vast majority of the population, the normal people, are unaffected by what has happened. That's high noble politics. As long as I get paid and as long as I can get the food from the feast, bit of a shame that it's now a morning feast rather than a wedding feast, but I'll still get my grub. It's actually quite disconcerting. It matters. We then move on to Act 5, which has very swift action with an incredibly complex ending. There are only 3 scenes, and the final scene in this play is 310 lines long. It's the longest scene in the entire play. So we start with a reasonably long scene, medium length, 86 lines. Romeo is in exile in Mantua. So we've seen the whole of Act 4, all about Juliet. Now we shift to Romeo. He speaks an 11-line short soliloquy portending death. He says, I've had a dream and there's death imagery in it. His servant arrives, Balthazar arrives with news from Verona about Juliet's death. Romeo immediately says to the audience, I came across this apothecary quite recently. Guy's a bit poor looking. I think I'll buy poison from him and kill myself. So that's what he decides to do. There's another shift back to Verona as Friar Lawrence finds out that his message to Romeo saying, by the way, she isn't actually dead, didn't get through. 2 very short moments, and then you have this incredibly complex scene to finish the play. There are 9 subsections here, right? Very complicated. First of all, poor old Paris turns up at Juliet's grave and sends his page away. He wants to be his own, to mourn the woman that he actually was about to marry. Now, whether he's doing this for the sake of form or whether he actually had personal affection for her, in a sense doesn't matter because he's not going to live much longer. Romeo turns up, uses tools to force open the Capulet family crypt. Paris comes forward and challenges him and is killed. So you get simultaneous staging. Paris is in the shadows watching what's going on. Romeo's now a proper man. Romeo doesn't muck about. There's Paris, okay, stabbed, dead, right next me. That's basically how it works. You then have Romeo's final soliloquy as he drinks his poison and dies. Friar Lawrence turns up, trying to stop anything bad happening, and Juliet wakes up. She dismisses the friar. Paris's page, remember he was dismissed, in the meantime turns up with members of the watch because he's not sure this is a good idea, leaving this guy, his master, alone in this family graveyard. They got a bit of a bad reputation. I'll go and get the watch. Juliet hears them arriving and stabs herself to death with Romeo's dagger that's lying there. The watch finds the bodies. Prince Aeschylus arrives, quickly followed by the Capulets and the Montagues, and the friar reveals everything. Very complicated, very clotted final scene. That's the plot of the play. Now, we're going to talk about study tips. How do you deal with this material if you're having to write about it? Now, my usual line here is, statistics are boring, but I've done the work for you, so don't worry about it. The length of the various scenes, the length of the various acts, tells you a great deal about how the play is constructed and how the speed works at different points. As I've said before, the acts in Romeo and Juliet turn out to be distributed in a noticeable pattern. 3 quite long ones followed by 2 much shorter ones, with the single longest scene in the play finishing everything off. Acts 1 to 3 carefully build events, exposition, plot exposition, up to the point where Romeo has to leave Verona. Act 4 is entirely about Juliet while Romeo is in exile. This suggests He can be abroad in the world because he's a man, while she has no choice but to try to deal with the social and familial consequences of their secret marriage. Their relationship, the way they act, is gendered differently. So, that's across the acts, if you like. Thinking about the scenes, much of the action of this play is distributed across scenes of relatively medium to long length, often subdivided into manageable sections. This smooths the exposition across most of the play. Short one-off scenes stand out as a result, often in the form of dramatic irony. Now, we tend to think in terms of characters as having primacy in a drama or a film. This is especially true of a play that contains probably the most famous love story in Western European culture, but this creates a problem because the events of the play to us seem to pull against the characters, the characterisation. The events seem rather forced. The play kind of starts off as a romantic comedy and is forced into becoming a tragedy when Mercutio is stabbed and Romeo kills Tybalt. How do we explain this? There are three instances where one could argue that for plays from this period, characterisation is secondary to the plotting. The events have primacy. The first thing to say, this might sound strange, but Renaissance audiences don't seem to have had any problem with shifts and changes in character as required by the plot. We are a different, much later, obviously, different visual culture, possibly because of movie conventions. The bad guy almost always stays as a bad guy. The hero almost always is a hero, and so on. Any character development is linear, it's a progression. But in this period, in these plays, characterisation can be contradictory. Roles shift, sometimes quite abruptly as well. So, for example, in Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, who's massively important in the early part of the play, is just killed off stage when she's no longer needed. She's fulfilled her plot function, she gets killed, that's it. Desdemona in Othello starts off as an incredibly powerful woman acting in her own right, like Juliet, and then quite meekly submits to being smothered to death by her own husband. What happened? In Romeo and Juliet, Romeo seems to become a sort of revenge figure almost purely by chance. Now, all of these examples will suggest that for these plays, character supports plot, not the other way round. The action does not necessarily flow from the characters in the first instance. A second example, or a second thing it's worth thinking about here, is the play's use of the chorus. Only appears twice in the play, at the beginning of the first and second acts, and the chorus tells the audience in no uncertain terms this is going to be a tragedy. It uses the sonnet form and refers to the fact it's a play. The theatre is a metaphor. This is typically Renaissance, very self-aware, self-reflexive drama. The chorus is telling you, as the audience, this is going to happen, so you already know it's going to be a tragedy. To us, the chorus is a minor figure. Some performances cut the chorus altogether because the chorus doesn't matter as a character, but the chorus is critical to the description of the plot. Plot matters more than character. That's one way to look at it. And the third thing I want to talk about is Mercutio and his death and the implications of it. Now, when he's carried off stage, dying, he shouts a very famous line, "A plague of both houses," sometimes rendered as "a plague on both your houses." Now, this doesn't seem to matter to us, but in this period, this is the single worst, nastiest, horrific thing you can wish on anybody. The plague is not funny, okay? This is a period where people die of the plague. A third of London regularly gets wiped out by the plague. This matters. This is a dying man cursing both households in the single worst possible way. Now, it turns out later in the play, in Act 5, Scene 2, that the message Friar Lawrence has tried to send to Romeo in exile to Mantua to explain that Juliet actually isn't dead, didn't get through because the brother, the other friar carrying the letters, got stuck in Verona on suspicion of being in a house with an infectious pestilence, in other words, the plague. So ironically and almost invisibly to us, Mercutio's curse comes true. It's the plague that gets them, effectively. So to conclude, remember the primacy of the social context in this play, not the characters. This is not a problem for Shakespeare's contemporary audience. Remember that the play begins with a riot and neither character is present. Okay? This is like Macbeth. In that play, the events are set up by the witches. In this play, events are set up by family hatred. This is something external to the characters. It's extrinsic to them. They act within that context, but they've got no choice. The reasons behind the family hatred is never actually explained, it's just taken for granted. And the seemingly sudden change from what looks to us like a comedy to a tragedy is prefigured by the chorus. You're told this is going to happen. This is probably why the chorus actually doesn't reappear after Act 2, because it's fulfilled its function. Act 3, Scene 1 sees the death of Mercutio and the death of Tybalt. We have problems with this because to us it seems artificially forced. But that's because our much later, different culture places so much emphasis on the prime importance of individual characters. Characters are not of quite that standing in a Renaissance drama, regardless of what you might think. So now we're going to have a few key words. The chorus is a figure that is uninvolved in the events of the play and gives you narration and prefigures what's going to happen. The sonnet is a 14-line poem of a certain kind. There are different types of sonnets, but basically it's a very condensed form, often associated with discourses of love in the period. The chorus speaks 2 sonnets, and Romeo and Juliet speak 1 when they meet. The exposition is the term we use. If you can get these terms into an essay, it looks really good. It's a process that reveals elements of the plot and the way they relate to one another. Simultaneous staging, remember this is a play, okay? Try and work that into an essay and hopefully you'll pick up points. Simultaneous staging divides the stage into separate zones that signify some sort of distance between the characters. The convention often is that one character is hiding from the others. The soliloquy is a full speech delivered directly to the audience by a single character on stage on their own, usually important characters. Offstage representation happens in this play as well. Things happen off stage which are extremely important, such as the marriage ceremony of Juliet and Romeo. We don't actually see that, remember that. What that does is it draws audience attention to the meanings generated by this event, not the event itself. Also, there's that phrase dramatic irony. There's quite a lot in this play. Moments where the audience has more knowledge of the overall plot and events than the characters who happen to be on stage at that moment. A fine example comes in Act 3, Scene 4, after Tybalt's been killed and Romeo banished. And Romeo and Juliet are already secretly married, and in the previous scene, Romeo has left to spend the night with Juliet. Act 3, Scene 4 shows her dad and Paris discussing the marriage, completely oblivious to what's actually happened. They just don't know. Another thing to remember is the emblematic moments, and in this play they're provided by the lower class characters. A really good one at the end of Act 4, Scene 5. It's the very end of Act 4, when the various servants just go about their normal business, even though the daughter of the household, the heiress to the household, has apparently just been found dead in her bed. Doesn't bother them. So, whatever you do with the play, good luck with your studies. If you want to know more, there are also videos on characterisation and context for the play, so please remember to subscribe.